Welcome back to Writers and Readers. With me now is author Robert Kirby, who's written a marvelous book called The Under Merchant's Woman. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Thank you, Tom.
I'd like to ask you, the book winds up in Australia.
Yeah.
What, for a Canadian guy living just outside of Toronto here, what drove you to write a book in Australia?
Like most people, I had never heard of the Batavia, and I guarantee most people haven't heard of the Batavia. But I happened to be in Fremantle, Western Australia, a couple of years ago, and I went and spent the afternoon in a maritime museum.
The Batavia is a ship, we should
The
tell.
Batavia is a ship, and they have a huge Batavia exhibit, and I spent probably the entire afternoon in looking at this one exhibit.
Oh my goodness.
And it's no exaggeration to say that I was so shocked and overcome by the story of the Batavia that I walked out of there with tears in my eyes. And I went to the bookshop in the museum and I bought 5 books on the subject.
My goodness.
Lugged them all the way back to Canada, digested them all, and then decided to write a novel, because most of the books are textbooks.
Yeah.
And I decided, and most of them focus on the main character who was the commander of the fleet. It takes place in 1629. The Batavia was a Dutch East Indiaman retour ship which was to sail between Amsterdam and Sumatra during the spice trade. And she was very much like the Titanic of her age. She was the largest, the most luxurious, the most modern ship in the world. And the 300 passengers and crew who boarded her on her maiden voyage considered themselves to be absolutely honoured to be on it.
So this is really the beginning of your story.
This is the beginning of the
this
story.
This is what you outline at the beginning.
Yes.
Tell the readers.
And just like the Titanic, she sank on her maiden voyage. She didn't hit an iceberg, she hit a reef off the coast of Western Australia. And most books focus on the official side of the story, from the commander's point of view and from the point of view of the Dutch East India Company. But there was a woman on board called Lucretia van der Meulen. She was a passenger, young, very beautiful woman who was travelling to Sumatra to be with her young husband, who was an under merchant. That is like a clerk to a merchant.
Sure. And so this is where the title for the story would come from. The Under Merchant's Woman.
Exactly.
And this is this young girl, and probably, I mean, I don't want to give too much away about the book, but the conflict between the characters on the ship.
And from her point of view.
Right.
She becomes the unwitting catalyst for one of the most horrific disasters in maritime history. Not only was it that the ship sank, but the fact that the crew were mutinying, and when they hit the reef, the 300 passengers struggled ashore onto a little tiny island, no bigger than a football field, with no water, no vegetation, no animals, and they had to survive on this island for 3 months until they were rescued.
My goodness.
And the mutineers took over the island and began to systematically murder the men and keep the women in. They became sexual slaves, basically.
Really? Now, they murdered the men, I would think, because they didn't want to have witnesses
They
hanging
didn't
around.
want
Is that
any
fair enough?
witnesses, and they also, of course, they wanted, I hate to be blunt about this, but they murdered the husbands so that they could take the wives.
Sure.
And the idea was that when a rescue ship came, the mutineers would capture the rescue ship and go pirating.
So this is a true story,
Yes.
a fiction, a novel, based on a true story.
Absolutely.
Of course, the dialogue would not be true. You're going to make that up. But how did you decide?
Some of the dialogue is true, I might add,
because of the
some of it
diaries
was
or whatever.
recorded in diaries, yeah.
So what dialogue did you use to drive the story forward? I mean, that's really what the author's going to input here to drive the story forward. Did you think about that?
Well, having read so much about the various characters, the personalities of the different individuals, the commander of the fleet who was on the ship, the captain, the first mate.
Sure.
The ship's, they call them predicate. It was the minister
Right.
on the
Right.
ship. And Lucretia herself, they were all very different characters. And how they interacted with one another to create such a terrible disaster,
Yeah.
that's
the interesting story.
That's what brings on the
Well,
dialogue,
you know, it's like
how
in-
they relate to one another.
For sure,
Yeah.
like in any novel or in real life, relationships are the most important thing in the world.
That's
And
right.
so when you get those characters together, clashing, that's gonna tell the tale. So let me ask you, what is it that you want to accomplish with this book? What is it that you want the readers? We got about a minute left. If you
Okay,
could help me.
I wanted to tell this story because it's a story that virtually nobody's heard of. Everybody's heard of Mutiny on a Bounty and the Titanic.
Yeah.
Virtually nobody's heard of the Batavia. And yet it's a story that is far more enormous in its impact
Sure,
than the
sure,
other two.
sure.
But most people would prefer to read it as a human interest story.
Yes, yes.
So that's why I decided to write it as a novel from the point of view of this young woman.
Absolutely.
It makes it more readable.
Well, it's a marvelous book. You can get it at Amazon, Barnes and Noble. That's the place to get it.
through my website.
Thanks for watching, readers and writers. For more information on any of today's guests, go to rogerstv.com. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.